Please join me in the prayer for illumination. Lord, open our hearts and minds by the power of your Holy Spirit, that as the scriptures are read and your word proclaimed, we may hear with joy what you say to us this night. Amen.
So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children in the third generation. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were also born on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land to the land that will bring you, the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So Joseph made the Israelites swear, saying, When God comes to you, you shall carry up my bones from here. And Joseph died, being 110 years old. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt.
Here now we're reading from Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 through 19. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way to the wilderness towards the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt, prepared for battle. And Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, God will surely take notice of you, and then you must carry my bones with you from here.
Joshua 24, verse 32. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Amor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants.
Do you remember that epic of the Old West, Lonesome Dove? If not, no worries. Just imagine with me two old cowboys, one-time Texas Rangers. One of them wears a hat exactly like this, although he doesn't look a thing like me. If someone played him in the movies, it would be Robert Duvall. His name is Gus. His companion sure does seem to favor a white-haired, white-bearded Tommy Lee Jones. But his name is Woodrow Call. These two old codgers have been through many dangers, toils, and snares, and up to now they've always made it out alive. But not this time. They're in Montana, and it's the winter. Gus is severely wounded, and he's not going to make it. He lingers long enough for the two old companions to argue about several matters, and then Gus asks Call for a promise. Promise me, he says, promise me that when I die, you'll take me back to South Texas. Bury me on that little hill overlooking the Guadalupe River in Clara's Grove. For Gus, it was a place where he had spent some of his happiest hours, and he wanted his body, his bones, to rest there forever after. Promise me, he said. Well, they argue about it for a while, but Call eventually agrees, and Gus dies. The problem is, did I mention they're in Montana? And it's winter. So the promise must wait. Call takes Gus's body and gets them to store him in a place where they keep the hams. He pays a man to build a strong wooden crate, and in the springtime, when the way begins to thaw, Call puts Gus's body in the crate, and he packs it with salt and charcoal, and he begins the long trek back to Texas. Just an old man and a cart and a crate carrying the body of his friend. It is an ordeal. Everything conspires against him. The rugged terrain, a treacherous river, a ruined cart, a broken down donkey. It very nearly kills Call to continue. There are many good reasons to stop. But for this true friend, there simply is no other choice. And at last he makes it to the promised spot. He takes out his shovel, digs a hole, buries Gus where he promised he would. Now, it's not exactly the same thing, because it's not about one man who keeps a promise, but instead a whole people. But it sure made me think that Larry McMurtry was familiar with the book of Genesis when he wrote Lonesome Dove, because right there at the end of the saga, in the text that we just heard read, Joseph is getting ready to die. He's 110 years old. He has risen to incredible and unlikely power in Egypt, but he does not want to be buried in Egypt. He wants to be buried in the promised land, in the plot of ground at Shechem that is precious to him. Promise you'll do that for me, he asked. Promise me you'll bury me at Shechem. We will, his people agree. And so Joseph dies, and they mummify him, packing his body in salt and wrapping him in strips of cloth, and they put him in a sarcophagus, and they wait. They wait in Egypt for many years until a Pharaoh arises who did not remember the legacy of Joseph. The people cry out for redemption. God hears and raises up Moses. When at last the Exodus is near, someone remembers about Joseph and that old promise. So they go and retrieve his sarcophagus and take it with them through the parted Red Sea, on through the wilderness. For 40 years they carry that coffin. Every time they break camp and get ready to move on, someone has to remember the mummy of Joseph. I wonder how many of us have ever served a church where they were still carrying around the mummy of a former pastor. The former time when things were different. That's what it was like for Moses. The bones of Joseph were always there to remind everyone of a former time, a time when they were respected, a time when they were confident that God had a plan. Why carry him around all that time? Surely there were many good reasons to bury Joseph and just get on with their journey. Well, yeah, for one thing, they promised, but times change, and forgetfulness can weave a mighty spell. I think they carried Joseph all that way, not because of the promise only, but also because they wanted to keep the story alive. Maybe they needed to keep it alive because they understood the story of Joseph to be foundational to who they were. And so they retold it by day as they trekked, told that story of the coat and the dreaming and his brother's scheming. They told it around the fires by night of the cupbearer and the baker and the troubled dreams of the Pharaoh and Joseph's unlikely rise to power. They wanted to remember not just the details of the story, but what it meant, how God was at work in the unfolding. They wanted to remember not just the trials that Joseph had endured, although tribulation was certainly a part of the story, but they wanted to remember especially how Joseph said at the last, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." As you noticed in the readings, it takes 5 more books of the Bible, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and clear to the end of the book of Joshua before they finally get him buried. Moses has died. He's buried at the foot of Mount Nebo in the land of Moab. His successor, Joshua, son of Nun, has died too and is buried in the family cemetery at Timnath. True to their word at last, the people take Joseph's worn-out sarcophagus and his badly jostled mummy. And they buried Joseph at Shechem in the plot of ground his dad Jacob bought back in the day. They say you can't take it with you. And that is certainly true for your stuff. But the sad fact is, you do take your story with you when you die, unless someone remembers it and tells it again. What you loved, what you were afraid of, what perplexed you, what vexed you, what was so beautiful it made you cry. All these things you take with you to the grave, unless someone remembers it and tells it again. Like many of you, I've stood in a lot of cemeteries and spoken the words of committal many times. But it's only in the past few years that I've begun to look at cemeteries in a whole new way. A few years ago, I began to research my mother's ancestors, including two of her great-grandfathers, who were also Texas Rangers. At the time, we didn't know much of anything about the Hill family in the generation before we got to Texas. What we discovered was a revelation. A generation earlier, her ancestors were prospering as merchants and mill owners and shipbuilders in Maine. And yet all of their children, young men and young women, had the hunger for adventure and hardship. In the 1830s, they left their parents' large, comfortable homes in Maine and came to Arkansas when the lands of the Louisiana Purchase were first opened up for sale. They founded towns and started businesses. They married and had families. These young adults thrived for a while. And then within a period of 25 years, almost all of them died, along with their children, in southern Arkansas, on the banks of the Ouachita River, at a place called Camden. We never knew. Nowadays, in that old cemetery in Camden, just at dusk, twice a year, they do little reenactments. The local historical society knows the dead there almost as well as Edgar Lee Masters knew the residents of Spoon River. Every year, they research and choose 8 or 10 people who are buried there, and someone who is about the age of the person they are reenacting will dress in period clothes and stand beside their grave with a lantern. And if you will stop and listen, they will tell you the story of their lives. We went and were stunned to find that 3 of the characters being portrayed were members of our Hill family. They did not know us, the survivors, and we had not known them. They had simply chosen these stories because they were beautiful or tragic, or they embodied the spirit of the times. And the good people of Camden, Arkansas had preserved them. These stories of our forgotten family had preserved them for over 150 years. You can imagine what a treasure that was to experience. And so now I've begun to look at cemeteries in a whole different way. These days, as I drive by, I can see all these people, the age they were when they died, standing beside their graves, willing to tell their stories to any who would pause a while and listen. A very few of you may be old enough to remember my dad, who was a pastor in this conference. He contracted cancer in his early 40s and died when he was 44 while he was a pastor of East Cross in Bartlesville. He died in 1973. In fact, he died on the Tuesday of annual conference. I was 19. Now, for those of you who are liable to quit tracking now so you can do the math, let me help. 1973 was 46 years ago. 19 plus 46 is 65. Over the years, I've often thought of Dad during the memorial service, but the place I've actually felt him the most profoundly is during the service of ordination. It may be because at my own ordination a few years later, I was feeling his absence especially keenly when he was not there to lay hands on me. And yet on that night, I did feel his hand there. And I do still from time to time. But even more deeply than remembering him at memorial or sensing him at ordination, there is a knowing that comes to me when I tell the story of my family. A large part of the way I experience God was formed in me at a very early age when our parents taught us to pray. There was the bedtime, this is the bedtime prayer that we children learned by heart. See if it sounds familiar. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Was that the one you learned? I keep looking for that version written in gentle cursive on a pastel background framed on the child's room today. I must have been in about the first grade because I was old enough to say my bedtime prayers by myself and go to sleep. Words were beginning to mean real things to me. So when I got to that third line of the prayer that night, I suddenly found myself in the middle of my first real existential crisis. If I should die? Did I just say if I should die? In a flash, I was a lot further from a quiet night of sleep than I had been. Dad, can you come in here? What is it? He said as he came. I can't go to sleep. What's this deal about if I should die? I'm afraid. What is it that you're afraid of? How would you die? I'm not sure. I guess the bad man might come in here and kill me. Ah. So how do you think he'd get in here? Where would he get in? Through the front door. Well, let's think about this. Your mom's in my room is the first one he'd come to. If he's coming after you, he's got to come through me first. Today I realize that night years ago was one reason I have such deep confidence in God. Even in the toughest, scariest, most grief-stricken moments of my life so far. In an eternal sense, I know God's got this. I feel it deep down, as deeply as I'm aware I can feel, but they're deeper than feeling. I know it. The way you know something when you've had an evangelical experience, which I did. I know God's got this. And if anything is ultimately to annihilate you or me, they'll have to come through God first. You've probably seen at least one episode of that genealogy program with the great title, Who Do You Think You Are? I like the show because it helps a person discover some of their not famous ancestors, people who may have lived quiet lives of strength and are probably forgotten to history. The show essentially gives you a chance to reclaim some of these forgotten narratives, and if you choose, you can add them to the narrative of your own life. Not long ago, I was sitting in an interview for a person in a high-profile position. One thing they said really stuck with me. Actually, they said, I'm not even the main character in the story of my own life. And isn't that exactly the point? I'm not the main character in the story of my own life. I am here by grace. And all of this is a great unfolding of the love of God in the world. So our stories about our loved ones are not only about who they were, but also the part of them that lives and grows in each of us. But it's also, if we choose to make it, a reliving, a living out of the grace of God. What if we drew for ourselves a family tree that included not only our biological and adoptive family, but also included everyone who has nurtured us in the faith? These spiritual kin are our family as well. Those we honor tonight, who have died during this most recent revolution of the earth around the sun, yes. And also those who have departed this earth in revolutions past. These are our DNA ancestors in the faith. They taught us who God is. They taught us how to pray. They taught us that God doesn't want us to be afraid. They taught us that we are creatures of precious and infinite worth. They called forth from us our best selves. A surprising amount of what they instilled in us is in us still. As we remember their victories and their defeats, their tragedies and their triumphs, we claim the grace that is beyond human doing. I think maybe that's why, way back in the narratives of our Genesis in the faith, we still tell the stories of Joseph and his brothers, and his father's favoritism toward Joseph, and that coat, and the sibling rivalry that it fired, and attempted fratricide, and lying, and imprisonment, and dreams, and ascendancy, and famine, and deceit, and at the end, forgiveness. After all of that, forgiveness. When Joseph gets a chance to sum it up at the end of his life, at the very end of the narrative of Genesis, right before he makes them promise to go all lonesome dove on his bones, Joseph speaks into history one of the great statements of faith. What you did, you intended for evil, but God intended it for good. He reminds us that redemption is more about God than it is about us. We're not even the main character in the story of our own lives. But the fact is that we have been here, we are here, and that fact can remind us that if we are open to it, even these vessels of clay can carry for a while the treasure of God's redeeming grace. And our lives, too, can bear witness to God's ongoing message to humankind. Others may have meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Who do you think you are? Amen.